در قسمت دیگری از برنامه بین خطوط در شهر ساحلی ایسبورن هستیم، در واحد ایسبورن دانشگاه برایتون، برای گفتگو با دکتر مارک دویج، کارشناس برجسته مطالعات جامعه شناختی فرهنگ هواداری فوتبال، در مسئله هواداران متعصب فوتبال در دنیای امروز و تأثیرات فرهنگ هواداران متعصب بر سیاست‌های خرد و کلان کشورها و تاثیرپذیری اونها در تحولات اجتماعی و فرهنگی و سیاسی کشورها و برنامه‌ریزی درازمدت برای کنترل یا هدفمند کردن یا تشدید و تعدیل فعالیت‌های هواداران متعصب فوتبال در عرصه‌های مختلف. Dr. Mark Doidge, thank you very much for accepting our invitation for this interview. I know you are a busy person and you've been in travel to European cities. Let's start with your recent trip to Lisbon. What happened?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me for the interview. I've just come back from Lisbon. So I sit on the committee for an organisation called Football Supporters Europe. Within that, what we do is we speak on behalf of fans around Europe. We speak on behalf of fans who are often seen as the problem and a problem to be regulated. And we're basically being that voice to say, well, we want to push back. So we want to speak to the clubs, the UEFA, the police, and various authorities to say, well, actually what we'd like to do is fans would like to stand at the game rather than having to be forced to sit down, or fans would actually like to have adequate facilities in stadiums, but also other things that fans do, like pyrotechnics, which they see as part and parcel of their fandom, actually advocating for that as well. So one of the pleasures of my job is to be able to go and meet different fans from around Europe, and you can see that sort of the wide range of different people that you meet and the different passion they bring, but also the different ideas they bring, and that's what makes football so interesting to me.
One of the important part of your studies is you have to deal with different people who are either not interested in your subject, or they ignore the importance of the subject, or they think they know everything about that. In terms of media, in terms of public opinion, in terms of politicians, even among the academic circles, they think they know everything they need to know about the fans, about the ultras, about the hooliganism. What do you think about that? How do you solve this misunderstanding?
Well, the interesting thing is, football is the most popular, probably, activity in the world, definitely the most popular sport. And because it's so popular, everyone has a position on it. So even if you don't like football, you often feel that you have to articulate your position against football. So football has quite an overpowering and overwhelming quite an overpowering and overwhelming aspect of our daily lives. But because it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, people often think that they know all about it because it's everywhere and they see it in the media, and they maybe consume podcasts and television shows and match day programs and books around it. But actually, that also is why I think an academic aspect is required, because often people focus on the sensationalized bit that goes in the media, the difficult bits, the violence or the excesses that some fans engage in, but actually miss the whole social aspects of what football fandom's about. And that's where I come in as a sociologist. It is difficult because the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu said back in the 1980s that sociologists of sport are doubly marginalised. They're marginalised within sport because they see sociology is seen as peripheral to the science of sport, and it's marginalised within sociology because it's seen as football's popular or it's just a problem area. Why are you researching that? But to me, football fandom is actually a really amazing way to understand how social groups form, which is actually fundamental to how we understand society, how we understand ourselves as individuals.
Can you please tell us briefly about your background and your early education and previous research before going to this specific field?
I've got a very unusual biography, I think, but I'd like to try and link it to football as well, because I grew up in the southwest of England. So I grew up as a Plymouth Argyle fan. So my father was a Plymouth Argyle fan, my grandfather was a Plymouth Argyle fan. They come from Plymouth, or my granddad grew up in Plymouth. And looking back now, it was a way of bonding with my father. We would go to games. It was a way of, me and my brothers would go, and it was part of that connection to the area. Seen it, part of Devon and Cornwall, is connection to my family, to my region, to where I grew up. But also, what's interesting is it was also the first time I ever engaged in what I might consider political activity, which is back in the 1990s. There were protests against the owner at the time. And I joined those protests.
Owner of the
Plymouth Argyle, yeah. So I joined those protests, and it was a protest against someone buying the club or owning the club, and it was a form of political mobilisation. But most importantly, it was a form of mobilisation around my fandom, around my act of consumption, which was football. I didn't realise it at the time, but that's what I was doing. Now, my academic journey is slightly different. I studied law as an undergraduate. Didn't really like it. Ended up working in a factory where my father worked, and my other grandfather had worked. Long story short, it was making things for the internet. The dot-com bubble burst. The factory started making redundancies, moved to China. I went to China to set up the logistics there, and went, oh, I'm out of a job. What do I do? So I decided to return to university, because I realised I wanted to learn more, and there was something about me that wanted to sort of get into something more academic. I actually studied a master's in ancient history. All my essays were on ancient sport, so the ancient Olympics and ancient sort of sports happening. Yeah, but also things happening in ancient Italy, in Etruria. Gave me an opportunity to study in Rome, which was something I'd always wanted to do. But through that journey, realised I would like to study modern sport. And I was living in Devon at the time. There was a professor at the University of Exeter who studied football fandom, and I said, I've got this real big interest about Italian fans. And one of the reasons was back in the 1990s again, there was a television programme called Football Italia with Jack Richardson, and I just remember seeing these Italian fans on the screen. There was flares, there was pyrotechnics, there was passion, there was chanting. It was a completely different experience, and I wanted to understand that. And that's why I would come back to why football's a really interesting thing to study, because even though it's commonplace and it happens all over the world, how people consume it is very different. So there's a cultural element to it, and how Italian football fans operate is very different to how English football fans operate, which is different to Indonesian fans or Brazilian fans. And because it's so commonplace, we can compare and contrast, and we learn more about ourselves as a society and as individuals through doing that.
So that led you to go to study football or have your fieldwork at Italian institutions?
Yeah, so I did my PhD at Exeter University, but my fieldwork was in Livorno in Italy, so a group of fans who were very political, or the performances they put on the terraces were very political. And again, that was something we don't do in England. We don't have openly political banners at stadiums, for example. So for me, it was a good example to understand, again, how football operates. And one of the things I would say about sport in general, but there are very few things across the history of human activity. There's religion, there's food, clothing, sex, sport, dancing, music, art. Those things across all of human history and across every human culture. So sport is one of those activities, and we can compare and contrast. And at Livorno, I got a really good understanding of Italian society, Livornese society, by being part of a fan group, living there and understanding how they operated. I actually understood more about myself as an English fan by being there than I probably did about learning about Italy.
Oh.
Just because the assumptions that I grew up with, what I assumed was what was typical for all football fans, was just very typical for maybe Plymouth Argyle fans or English fans or white male fans in a football fan group, rather than all of football fans, because football fans are heterogeneous. They're not homogenous. They are different, and they come from different walks of life and different backgrounds, and they just operate differently. So therefore, all the assumptions that I grew up with, that this is what it is and what being a football fan's about, suddenly made me go, actually, maybe this isn't typical. We can see how Italians operate, and again, different fan groups operate in Italy, how different fan groups operate in England, and then it sort of challenged my own presumptions and my own bias in some cases as well.
Have you found them more complex than British fans or English fans?
Well, this is what led me into researching around ultras, because English fans do mobilise and we do think about things, and one of the things that's been quite interesting since the 1990s in England, and we can sort of see the disciplinary field of football studies sort of growing around this, is how it shifted from being around hooliganism to being around political activity and consumption, and seeing how football fans operate. And often what fans in England have done is formed like what's called an independent supporters association or supporters trusts. So they've tried to either get a voice on the board or to campaign around specific aspects of their fandom. Some of that could be just the owner or the manager, just getting rid of the manager. But in some cases, Manchester United, for example, their supporters association formed in order to keep the disabled section at Old Trafford when Old Trafford was being renovated. Closer to home here, Brighton Hove Albion fans were fighting A, their owner, but B, being moved to Gillingham, 50 miles away, bringing them back from Gillingham, and then getting a stadium, which is now the Amex, which is on the edge of Brighton. And it was a long struggle, and therefore that's something that was very particular to Brighton, but as also we could see how they operated was quite typical to what many England fans might do, fans in England might do. In Italy, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. And what I saw in Italy was a phenomenon called the ultras, which originated in Italy in the late 1960s. And it's a particular style of fandom. Partly it's about the visual display, the banners, the flags, the pyrotechnics, the chanting. But it is also organised in a very different way. So although a lot of football fans, and again, I come back to the point, why is football important, and why do people, and your earlier question about, we know about football because we've seen a football match. Well, actually, that football match only takes place at 90 minutes on a Saturday or a Sunday, and actually it's lived every day for football fans in conversations, their consumption on social media or on media, watching television programmes, reading newspapers. That match goes on and on through conversations. People will be recalling a match they went to 10, 20 years ago because they live it. That history is lived and repeated in the present. So for me, what's interesting about football fans and ultras in particular is not what happens at the match. It's what happens outside of the match. The match is the tip of the iceberg. And as a sociologist, I want to see the other social aspects. And it's going to a bar, planning the choreographies, the big images, the banners. It's the conversations that take place, how they think about being a fan, how this links to their community in some cases. So do they do community work? Do they collect for food banks? Or and in some cases, coming back to Livorno, there were floods about 5 or 6 years ago that basically destroyed part of the city. The ultras were the ones who came out to get people out, to clear up, and and that's happened in Germany more recently with floods there. And ultras in particular are a network of fans, but they meet regularly. They talk about their fandom regularly in order to then present it at the stadium. So the stadium's the very last bit of that, and it might just happen for 2 minutes at the start of a game, and then it's right, we're on to the next one. But for me as a sociologist, the ritual of football every week where they meet, and it's an ongoing one where they meet regularly during the week, they meet at the weekend, and then they keep going.
Looking at your publications and research about football, you had a book on Italian football fans, and also you have one book on sociology, it's a textbook. You have two recent publications with other colleagues, one called The Ultras, a Global Fan Phenomenon, and one Ultra, The Passion of Performance of Contemporary Football Fandom. If you can, please tell us briefly what is your definition and what is the difference between these three words, fan, ultra and hooligan?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, fan is someone who is passionate and engaged about the club they support, but it could equally be, you could be a fan of a particular movie star or a particular type of television program. But it's someone who's actively engaged with their active consumption, if we're going to use academic language. An ultra is a particular type of football fan, so it's a subset of football fandom. It is those who see the club, but more importantly, themselves as the most important thing. So when I talk about the rituals of football, we go on a Saturday to watch the game, and in sociology there's a French sociologist, Émile Durkheim, who writes about religion, and it's the rituals are what creates the symbols. It's a totemic focus, it's a ritual focus, that is the activity that brings us, a group of disparate people who live separate lives, together to do this one event, and then we are symbolised within this collective that comes around this moment. And football fandom is that. Once a week we come to a stadium, we chant together, we sing songs together, we wear maybe the clothes, the colours which symbolise our fandom and our identity with that club. Ultras are a subset of that, who live that even more. They themselves are also a symbolic focus of themselves, so they will have particular names about who they are, often with the dates where they were formed. They will have their own stories about things that have happened. It could be away games, it could be maybe violent interactions, it could be choreographies that they've done, big sort of performances. But they operate all week, and they will meet together as a collective all week. So they will have a headquarters, they will talk about things, and often it's encapsulated in a particular style. So there are certain acts of being an ultra. So there are potentially operating together as a collective. It will be certain banners, certain flags. They will organise what's called choreography, so they'll put on coloured pieces of cards or big banners that go across the entire side of the stadium. It could and has done descends into violence. So part about being the collective is about we're going to defend our space or defend our territory, and this is where it sort of often gets linked into hooliganism. Which can be then problematic. Now, hooliganism is slightly different. So hooligans are associated with England. So almost what we have is two styles of fandom. Ultras that started in Italy and hooligans that started in England. There has always been violence associated with football matches, but then there's always been violence associated with mass gatherings of people, be it political demonstrations, be it any other form of sort of collective identity. Hooligans are much less organised. Often it is very much around masculinity. It's about defending territory and proving oneself. So it's the football match almost becomes the excuse to meet.
To use or abuse that for another purpose.
Yeah, but there's still, again, rules within it. It's about fighting other hooligans, not fighting members of the public, not fighting scarfers, people with scarves. It's about status between particular clubs or particular fan groups. And it's much more organic. It might be people organising things, ringing up and saying, right, we're going to meet at this pub or this car park. And it can be organic. It can be
political sectarianism.
But sometimes it'd be associated with that. Whereas with ultras, again, a lot of the violence is organic. What I would say from my research in Italy is, and something that hasn't been focused in early studies of hooliganism, particularly from the media, is the role of the police within all of this. Some recent research from colleagues, Clifford Stott in particular, and Stott and Riker and John Drury and others, is the role of the police can have an impact on how that violence either sparks or continues. The sociologist Randall Collins has also illustrated how a particular group like police can almost instigate, get on the front foot and try to put down problems by being aggressive, which actually then causes people to react.
Or maybe other way around.
And it can be the other way around. So he calls it forward panic. So maybe the fans themselves get on the front foot and just think, well, we're going to get hit by the police, let's operate. And it's understanding those dynamics. Now, again, most of the people focus on the negative, the violence. Some ultras groups have engaged in ideological politics, far right and racist activities, and often that's focused on. Some are also are connected to organised crime. So often the media and politicians might focus on those bits. But there's also all this other bit that, as a sociologist, I'm interested in. If we focus on those aspects, the negative aspects, we almost essentialise them and we almost make ultras, that's all they're about. Whereas actually there's lots of other activities. And I'm going to come back to, it's a good way of understanding how groups form. It's the emotion, it's the performance, the ritual, it's who we are, who you are, how do we see ourselves, how do I see myself as part of that collective, how do we interact with other people, how often do we meet, how do we meet, all of those things can be explained through ultras. And for me, the ritual and the emotional aspects and those performances that are put in place is what differentiates ultras from maybe other fans as well.
کازابلانکا، شهری که نامش با یکی از بهترین فیلم‌های تاریخ سینما گره خورده است. اما برای کسی که عاشق فوتبال است، داستان از این استادیوم و پسران سبزش آغاز می‌شود. رجای کازابلانکا از روز تأسیس خود همواره به مردمی بودنش می‌بالد و قلب تپنده شهری است که رو در روی نظام سیاسی کشور می‌ایستد. باشگاه فوتبال رجا پلی است بین مردم با حاکمیت. مردم ناراضی از وضعیت کشور که خواستار تغییرات سیاسی، اجتماعی و فرهنگی در میهنشان هستند. اولتراهای رجا را به عنوان مخوف‌ترین اولتراهای قاره آفریقا می‌شناسند. آنها یک سوی دربی پرشور شهر کازابلانکا هستند و طرف دیگرش باشگاه فوتبال وداد است. وداد نماینده قشر متوسط جامعه است که رابطه خوبی با نظام حاکم دارد و این دربی کازابلانکا را فراتر از یک بازی فوتبال می‌برد. باشگاه رجا و بازی فوتبال وسیله‌ای است برای احقاق حقوق و استادیوم میعادگاهی است برای هواداران تا مسائل سیاسی و اجتماعی را در آنجا حل کنند. در دربی سال 2009 14 نفر دستگیر شدند و 4 سال بعد 200 نفر دیگر که اعتراضها را از استادیوم به خیابان آورده بودند. هواداران رجا با کوروگرافی‌های هنرمندانه همواره حمایت بی‌دریغشان را از رجا نشان می‌دهند و استادیوم محمد پنجم را به جهنمی سبز تبدیل می‌کنند. با صداهایی فراتر از سر، امید، زندگی، عشق، اتحاد و ایمان به روز بهتر گرد هم می آیند. اکنون چند سال است دربی کازابلانکا دیگر در استادیوم محمد پنجم برگزار نمی شود و در استادیومی بیرون شهر دو تیم وداد و رجا مسابقه می دهند. برای اولتراهای رجا فرقی نمی کند کجا و کی و چطور. آنها تیمشان را با دل و جان حمایت می کنند. رجا 11 بار قهرمانی در لیگ فوتبال مراکش، 3 قهرمانی در لیگ قهرمانان آفریقا و 2 نایب قهرمانی در جام باشگاه‌های جهان را در کارنامه خود دارد.
Mark, can you tell us about the origins of the ultras and their speeding across the globe?
Yeah, I think it's again quite an interesting story about how wider society and fans come together, because football doesn't operate in a vacuum. It very much operates as part of a wider social and political framework. And the ultras originated in the late 1960s, but in particular they took off in the 1970s, and that was a very political time for Italy. It was called the years of lead. There was a lot of political terrorism, so there was fascist bombs, there was the Red Brigades who allegedly kidnapped and murdered the leader of the Christian Democratic Party. So there was lots of political terrorism and lots of political protests in general. That wasn't unique to Italy. There was wide-scale protests in 1968, for example, in Czechoslovakia, in France, in England, in America. And the banners and the political paraphernalia, the flags, the chants, they were taken into the stadium. So you start to see a particular style of fandom. But also for those early fan groups, they're often associated with political or ideological politics, so left and right in particular. And there's still a sort of a legacy of that in some cases. Television takes off in the 1980s. As I said, I started watching Italian football in the 1990s. So Serie A was seen as the best league, the most beautiful league in the world. La Liga più bella del mondo. And I was one of those people that started seeing it in the 90s and could see it on television. Now, the style of fandom, the performances of the ultras are such that people around the world could see them. So you could see them on the television. So you could start to copy them. And that's what started to happen 80s and 90s. Started spreading often as well with fans going to tournaments. So actually international tournaments were quite big at this point, or quite influential at this point. So the movement of people where they see other cultural forms happening and then start to appropriate them. So what we see in 1982 was the World Cup in Spain. English hooligans were going there. So some fan groups, for example PSG fans, maybe ended up sort of copying English fans and being maybe more associated with hooliganism. Same with Feyenoord and Amsterdam, Ajax fans. England fans or fans of English clubs going to, say, the Netherlands because it was easier to travel, and then getting into fights, and then that style being picked up. But equally, Italian fans were taking the ultra style to Spain in 1982, the 1984 European Championships in France, and you start to see other fan groups picking up the flags or the pyrotechnics. So you see the ultra style starting to spread. And what we start to see is the hooligan style almost moving into northern France, the Netherlands, into Germany, Scandinavia. The Italian ultra style sort of moving in across the Mediterranean, so into Marseille, Barcelona, into the Balkans and Croatia, Serbia.
Other continents.
And then now in the 21st century, it's going into North Africa. So some of the most spectacular choreographies is happening in Morocco, is happening in Egypt, it's happening in Indonesia, because again, now we've shifted from television to social media, and we've got YouTube. and we can watch fan groups from all over the world. I follow them on Instagram. It's easy. You see these fan groups and they're acting in a certain way, and you go, ooh, so we can do something like that. And fans copy each other. And there's Manchester City fans will do something called the Poznan, because they saw fans at Les Poznan in Poland jumping up and down with their backs to the match pitch. Icelandic. Yes, yeah, exactly. The Icelandic fans doing the sort of Viking clap. So people start to copy it and appropriate it and then change it, because that's how culture works. It's not fixed. It's not something that there's a British culture or a French culture or Italian culture. We interact with people and we pick up things and we act and we change, and and again, football is a good way of understanding how this culture changes.
New term in terms of in media, they call it glocal.
Yes. Yeah.
Both global and local.
Yeah. So there's a colleague at Loughborough, Richard Giulianotti, and he worked with someone called Roland Robinson. They called it glocal, the global and the local. And you can see these global phenomena happening, but changed in a local way. And I think
modified in a specific region.
Absolutely, yeah.
We already know in this conversation about how the football and the fandom and ultras or hooliganism help the sociologists to understand the world. But if I ask you, what is the contribution of sociology to this study?
So for me, sociology helps us explain, if we think about the iceberg, and there's a tip of the iceberg, and that tip of the iceberg is the football fans on a Saturday doing something. The bit underneath the water is the sociology, the small interactions that take place, the social relationships that are formed of the networks of fans who are operating and mobilising. To a certain extent, the psychology of the individuals, the egos that bring some people to push themselves forward and to try to get fans to do something, but equally also understanding ourselves as individuals, that we connect to a group because we're social animals. And one of the things I think is so interesting about football is the ontological conflation of the self to the group. People who are football fans will say, "Oh, who are you playing at the weekend?" And you'll say, "Oh, Manchester United." But Manchester United's playing Liverpool. But you're not Manchester United. You identify with them and they symbolise something to you. But you're, as an individual, conflating yourself with that group. And that, I think, is the most important thing about football and sociology, is how do we locate ourselves as an individual within that social structures and the social relationships of our wider society.
Yeah. Thank you. In your research, part of one of your books, you draw a line between supporters and consumers. Can you tell us about this differentiation, please?
Effectively, all fans are consuming football. Because we pay our money, we go to the game. But there's also a difference between how we consume and how certain fans will go along to buy the official merchandise of the club. They will go and buy their match ticket. They will go to the official, to the stadium early. Maybe they'll be taking lots of photos. And their consumption is very much around, I'm buying this experience. I'm going to Old Trafford, I'm going to the Emirates, I'm going to Parc des Princes. I'm buying this experience. But for ultras and for fans, I think more generally, the experience is social. It's about who you're going with, what the experience means to you as a person, as an individual, rather than as just a pure consumer, someone who's buying this experience. It's something that's done all throughout the week. It's something that you do, in conversations with your friends, in WhatsApp groups, at work, in the bars, in the restaurants throughout the week, and therefore you are actively engaging in a different way. But equally, you're still consuming, but also you are producing the consumption as well. So for ultras in particular, they are producing their own banners, in some cases producing their own T-shirts, their own stickers, their own merchandise, which they then themselves consume. So it's a much more democratic, in some cases, much more grassroots organisation. So it's not coming through the football club, who may be operating on a more global level. It's actually the group themselves saying, this is who we are, this is what we want to produce, and this is how we want to consume it. And I think that's quite interesting.
In the slang Persian language, we call ultras that people who are affected by typhuses. Can you tell us what this word came from?
Yeah, so actually it's the same for Italian. So the Italian word for fan is tifosi, or tifoso for the singular, tifosi plural. And again, it's from typhus. It's basically you have a fever. You are delirious and you can't control yourself. And I think that's also why I wanted to connect to emotions, because that's one thing that hasn't really been discussed in football fan studies, but also in some cases wider sociology. We are emotional human beings, and one of the things I would say that in the moment that a goal is scored, there is one group of fans absolutely celebrating, jumping up and down, delirious like they have typhus, and there will be another group of fans who are deflated. I mean, it can be the players as well. I mean, I can think of the image 3 years ago when Spurs played Ajax Amsterdam in the semi-final of the Champions League, and Spurs had just got... Ajax were attacking, nearly scored, and Spurs had gone down the other end and scored. And you could see the image on the players. You know, one group of players is delirious with joy, and the Ajax fans are just deflated on the pitch. Yeah. And Manchester United, 1999. There's images of I can't remember the play. Kufur, I think, was Solskjaer scoring, and the Man United players, but like Sami Kufur, the Bayern Munich defender, just absolutely like hitting the ground. And in that moment, the emotion of two different groups of people clearly divides them into two separate groups, and that again is how those the contrast there is. We got two different groups here, even though they're all engaging in the same ritual, the same match, the same sport. They're now divided into two groups, and it's purely on emotion.
One of the points you made earlier, briefly, I want to talk about that in more details, is the connection from normal or classic media to social media in terms of space changing for culture and cultural fans and ultras and hooligans. How it moved from normal media to social media, this fandom, ultras and hooliganism, and how they can polarized in social media especially.
I mean, social media is a really interesting one for fans because, again, it's that shift away from something centrally controlled to a more democratic space, or to one that's controlled by the fans themselves or the ultras themselves. So the roots of this is in what's been called fanzine culture in the 70s and 80s, where rather than all the official media or the official news of the football club coming through the match programme or through the local newspaper or national newspapers, who had basically told the journalists, you know, what was available and what information to pass on. In the 1980s, with fanzines, which was taken up from music, from punk in particular, is fans themselves were producing the media. They were commenting on the club or the owner or the manager or the players. They were making jokes about it. They were providing their own tactical analysis. And what we've seen as this has shifted is how fans, again, aren't just passive consumers. They are actively producing. And we can see it even with traditional print media. The sector has matured. It's not purely just talking about, oh, this is who played and this is who scored. It's now we're talking about, we have podcasts, we have quite expensive magazines talking about tactics, talking about the culture, the material culture of fandom. So the materials of scarves, of the styles of the fashion of football jerseys. So we have a whole range, a whole cultural sector that's around this. And within this, you've got fans producing podcasts. Arsenal TV is a good example of fans themselves producing a YouTube channel, but equally on fanzines they produce it. But that's just a collective doing something. On Twitter, on Facebook, you as an individual can have a voice now. Now, what that has led to is, and the current research that I'm currently working on, which has started on online hate and how fans are engaging in discriminatory and racist behaviour. But so it can lead to that, but it can also lead to fans mobilising in particular ways of saying, right, okay, what are we not happy with? How can we collectively bring back standing at a stadium, for example, or how do we get reduced ticket prices, or how can we have pyrotechnics at a stadium because it's been banned? That gives everyone a voice, all those fans a voice. So we're starting to see that democratisation happen. But equally, it's also for those groups and them producing their own content. So if you're an ultra, you've got a choreography, you go, this is going to be, we spent months on this choreography, right? We get the cameras in place, we get our Twitter and our Instagram feeds going, and we start sharing it with the right hashtags. It's independent of media moguls or the print media.
Massive distribution.
And it can go around the world very quickly.
– 1342 ورزشگاه امجدیه. شاه برای بازگشایی جام قهرمانی فوتبال ایران به استادیوم آمده است. بازی قرار است بین باشگاه شاهین تهران و باشگاه دارایی آغاز شود. اما همه روی سکوها تمرکز بازیکنان را به هم ریخته است. بازی نیمه کاره میماند. هواداران شاهین روی سکوها آرام و قرار ندارند. شاه استادیوم را ترک می کند و مدتی بعد لیگ به طور کلی تعطیل می شود و این تعطیلی به فصل بعد نیز می کشد. این آغاز کینه سران رژیم از این باشگاه می شود تا روزی که آن را به کلی منحل کند.
باعث و بانی شد به این شکل عنوان کردن که مردم، برای اینکه گزارشی که به دربار داده شد، که مردم موقعی که تیم شاهین رو تشویق میکنن اون ضرباهنگی که میزنن دام داره دام 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 شاهین، میگن دام داره دام دام، یه عده میگن شاه و یه عده میگن هین. و شما میدید این اعتراض مردم به صورت بود. اینو رو گزارش دادن و بعدش هم خب عوامل خودشون گفتن که در این باشگاه رو ببندید.
باشگاه فوتبال شاهین مهمترین، قویترین و تأثیرگذارترین باشگاه فوتبال دهه‌های 30 و 40 ورزش ایران بود. باشگاهی که مؤسسش عباس اکرامی با شعار اخلاق، درس و ورزش آن را بنیان گذاشته بود. در آن دهه‌ها مردم بیشتر هوادار سه تیم تاج، دارایی و شاهین بودند. عباس اکرامی بعد از کودتای 28 مرداد و با علایق ملی‌گرایانه و گرایش‌های ضد انگلیسی با تأسیس باشگاه شاهین رو در روی تیم‌هایی می‌ایستاد که در دربار نفوذ داشتند. مردم شاهین را نماد مبارزه و سکوهای امجدیه را مرکز مخالفت با دستگاه حاکم می‌دانستند و هر هفته از روی سکوها شعار می‌دادند. به خصوص هفته‌ای که تاج یا دارایی مقابل شاهین بازی داشت. شاهین تا میانه دهه 40 در دل مردم جا باز کرده بود و این کینه را در دل تیم‌های درباری چرکین‌تر می‌کرد تا سرانجام در سال 1346 در مسابقه بین شاهین و تهران جوان جو زمین و نیمکت به هم ریخت و این درگیری به سکوها کشیده شد. بازی رها شد و همه چیز به گونه‌ای پیش رفت که سازمان ورزش با فشار فدراسیون فوتبال رأی به انحلال باشگاه شاهین بدهند. هدفی که سالها دنبال آن بودند.
تیمی بود که متعلق به مردم بود و تیمی بودش که متعلق به مردم شد و تیمی بودش که همیشه به علل مختلف با موفقیت خودش، با موفقیت‌هایی که به دست می آورد، نهایتاً سخنگوی اعتراضات مردم به دستگاه حکومتی بودش. به همین دلیل مورد حسد خیلی ها قرار می گرفت که به حال وابستگی های آنچنانی داشتن.
باشگاه شاهین روی کاغذ منحل شد، اما در دلها هرگز. چیزی که طرفداران اکرامی به آن مکتب شاهین می گفتند. مکتبی با اخلاق و وطن دوستی.
One of the points you made in this book several times, and your other colleagues as well, is the connection between ultras and hooliganism with politics and politicians. How can you describe this connection, if it's really happening?
Well, in Italy in particular, I can speak to that, and I picked up this from a book written by Gianluca Vialli, who played for Chelsea, played for Sampdoria, Juventus. Yeah, he identified that in some cases the ultras are a useful group for the president of a club. If, for example, they want to sack the manager but don't want to look bad, they can ask the leaders of the ultras groups to start singing against the manager, and therefore it becomes what we're actually now seeing is it's quite populist. It's a way that, okay, the people are asking for this, I will therefore give them what they want. But there is actually a political network behind the scenes. There is what I consider, particularly in my book on Italian football, about patronage. It's about clientelism. It's about, okay, and drawing on anthropology and the work of Marcel Mauss and the gift. A gift is not something that's just given. It's something that is about establishing a relationship. So if you give something, you want something back in return. So if a president wants the fans to maybe cause problems, if they want a decision to go their way, Silvio Berlusconi has done this when he was president of AC Milan and also Prime Minister of Italy. He said, we have to pass this law that effectively gets rid of the debt of Italian clubs, otherwise the ultras will be a problem and there'll be riots in the street. So he's using the threat of violence to basically justify why his business should be given a tax break.
Sometimes the tuning slogans.
Exactly. And but the fact the ultras don't do that just because they want to or just because of power. There's a relationship, and often those presidents would give free tickets to ultras groups. They would give certain concessions to ultras groups. Some of those, I mean, Lazio irreducibly actually controlled the merchandising for Lazio at one point. So and they often can sell on those tickets, which also opens up a whole other can of worms, which is organised crime. There was a big story, Tobias Jones wrote about it, who's an English author living in Italy, about a member of the Juventus ultras in Turin who was getting tickets but then selling them on, or the mafia was then selling them on, and that person, I can't remember his name now, but he was founded a suicide spot in Turin.
It's interesting in Persian language in Iran, sometimes when the owners or other influential figures on the team wants to remove the manager, they have a slogan or rhyme against him, and the ultras repeat it in the stadium, say Haya kon raha kon. It's a short form that means have shame, leave the club.
Yeah, and that happens quite regularly. I mean, often fans themselves will determine, and again, it's a form of democracy. It's we don't want the manager, but then equally, as a sociologist, what I would start to investigate is, well, why is that relationship happening? And it's about power. And I think as a sociologist, as Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, said, power is the most important form of analysis for social scientists. Because why do managers exist in football? They operate to basically protect the owners and the presidents of clubs. So historically, what used to happen is you'd have a committee, the committee of the club, the board, would pick the team. When those fans started to criticise the board, they installed a head coach or a manager in who basically became the lightning rod for the abuse and the criticism, and therefore removing the board from the criticism. And occasionally, as we've seen with Newcastle, sometimes with Arsenal, people do criticise the board or they criticise the owner. However, most of the time the manager is the person that gets the blame, and actually what they are doing is operating within a structure of a club, within a particular finance set of structures or a particular organisation, a certain organisation that actually the president or the board is the one running and maybe not running very well. And often the team is just, poor performance of the team might actually just be an indication of how badly the whole club is run, but that's actually not the manager's fault. But the manager is the one that gets the blame. So I think for us, and again why football I think is important, is it helps us to explain those different power structures. And why do we just go and blame the manager? Yeah, I would say, making an analogy.
Plenty of other elements.
Exactly. I would make the analogy in Britain is often people complain about the local council, but don't complain about the national government. And why is the local council there? Is probably to protect the national government. Yeah.
Easy target.
Yeah.
Obviously, when you talk about Newcastle, we talk about the pre-Saudi Newcastle. Now it's different time. This is my not very last, but last question. You talked about there were politics and politicians in football, but we all know in some degrees the ultras and hooligans are affected by different parts of social problems like hate, like racism, like match fixing or something like that. Can you describe about, I mean, apart from politics and politicians, about these social wrongdoings in football and their relation to the ultras and hooliganism?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that the media like to focus on, and for me personally, there are lots of elements of ultras fandom that I really enjoy. I like the pyrotechnics, I like the performances, I like the choreographies, but I don't understand the hate, and I don't understand that visceral hate of rivals. But what I really don't understand is the racism and the sexism and those aspects of it. So, but part of it is, again, why sociology and why we should look at this academically is we have to go in and understand these groups. We have to research these groups. Being a journalist just looking in on it, or being a politician just looking in on it, you don't get to understand what the groups are really like. You don't really understand, okay, what are the aspects, what are the conversations that are taking place? How do these come about? For example, we can criticise, and I believe we absolutely should criticise England fans and many other fans for racism towards players. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum. Football is, despite politicians and despite some sections of the media saying football is apolitical, well, everything is political, and nothing says something is political more than a politician saying it's not political. So once a politician says it's not political, it pretty is political. But equally, what we can see is that football fans are part of society. They are not... racism is a problem in football. It always has been, but racism is a problem in English society. We have a Prime Minister who's written racist things as a journalist. We have a print media that has published writers who are racist, who allow that conversation to take place. With the England team in particular, there were politicians criticising footballers for taking the knee as a protest against racism, and predictably, as soon as 3 black players missed penalties, they were bombarded with racism. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. The politicians are making those comments, the journalists are making those comments. So why are we then surprised that football fans might make those comments? But what football can do is it becomes a space where that conversation can take place, which often doesn't happen, because I grew up in Plymouth, or near Plymouth, Devon, southwest of England. It's a very white place, very few people from who've migrated there from around the world, very few people of colour. So when anti-racism activities happened in the 1990s, a lot of people said, no racism here. But then for people like me, it was also, well, I don't know anyone who's black or brown or Chinese or from any other part of the world because all my friends are white and the world is white. But I could understand when we were talking about, you know, A.D. Littlejohn, who played for Plymouth Argyle, or Ronnie Morget, who played for Plymouth Argyle, and then being able to link those experiences to them as an individual, as a human being, helped me then understand about racism and what they might face and why it was wrong. And we're still having those conversations today. You know, Raheem Sterling has led, Tyrone Mings has led. We're having the conversation in cricket with Yorkshire Cricket Club, absolutely. But it's actually spaces where we wouldn't normally be talking about these things. And that's where, again, sport can be a useful space. It highlights it, and it's a problem, but it's also a space to tackle it and have the conversations.
It's true. And as you said, this is part of your current and future publication.
Yes.
That's interesting. It's very interesting to talk to you because you talked about something, you touched a subject. We all think we know everything about that, but when you talk about that, we realize we don't know anything about that, or less than we need to know about that. I think that's very important part of your research, and that's why I love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for